helping businesses make it through lockdown, getting performers back on their feet and letting you get into your super again. Welcome to Q&A. It's great to be with you live from a very exuberant Melbourne tonight. Joining me on the panel, Artistic Director of Short Black Opera and Yorta Yorta woman Deborah Cheetham, Liberal Senator for New South Wales Andrew Bragg, Lord Mayor of Sydney Clover Moore, Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy and Member for McMahon Chris Bowen, who's locked down in Fairfield tonight, and author and founding director of the Sweatshop literacy movement, Mohammed Ahmad, who's also joining us via Skype from Western Sydney. Please make them all very welcome. Now you can stream us live on iView and all the socials. Quanda is the hashtag. Please join the debate and let us know what you're thinking, how you're doing tonight in various lockdown and released places. Now our first question is on video and it comes from Ron Owl.
Most of my relatives and friends work in either construction or traffic control. They live in the Fairfield LGA and they've been forced to either take annual leave or they've got no work. And $750 from the government just isn't going to cut it. We don't have the luxury of working from home. My uncle, for instance, has a wife and kids to look after and a mortgage to pay. On top of that, there is so much police right now in Fairfield and there are choppers in the air every couple of hours. It feels like we're being treated like criminals. We are so frustrated, we are angry, and we are so depressed. When is the government going to end this lockdown, get the police out, and now the army out, and allow us to get back to work?
It's a very frustrated and angry Ron Owl there. And Mohammed Ahmad, I'll start with you. Does that reflect any of the feeling you're picking up where you are?
The answer is yes. That question is complicated. I'm going to have to answer it from two ends. So firstly, we have to talk about it from people's individual responsibilities during a crisis. The other day, a gentleman that I read about tested positive for COVID, but still thought it was a good idea to go out and buy a pair of dumbbells. Because, you know, during a global pandemic, the most important thing in the world is the size of your biceps. We have to recognize that this is an incredibly serious situation. And the person that I've been thinking a lot about lately is Dr. Jamal Rifi, who is a doctor in Belmore. And, you know, he was present when my grandmother passed away in 1997. He was there for her last breaths. And since then, he's been looking after my mum and dad into their senior years. He's been looking after me and my 5 siblings, and he's looking after our kids. I'm not asking the people in Western Sydney or anywhere else in the country to listen to our politicians. I actually understand that they've let us down, that they've confused us. In many ways, they've betrayed us. But I am asking you to listen to the doctors in your neighbourhoods who have been looking after our families for generations.
Mohammed, I'll leave it there for one second. I just want to quickly hear from the panel, but it's interesting to hear that slightly different take, I guess, on the situation that Ron and others and you find yourselves in. Chris Bowen, your response to Ron?
Yeah, thanks, Virginia. I certainly understand what is motivating Ron's comments, but Mohammed is right. We do need to follow the medical advice. The medical advice is that lockdowns work. But certainly I think that in Fairfield's case, it has been tough, and I think a lot of people have misunderstood throughout wider Sydney what Fairfield has been dealing with. A lot of well-meaning journalists asked me at the beginning of this, why are the people of Fairfield still moving about? You know, why aren't they getting the message? It's not about getting the message. We have a very industrialised workforce, a heavily construction and transport-focused workforce. People can't work from home. And it has not been just good enough to say work from home. A lot of people, the vast majority of people in my community cannot work from home. I'm very glad that the economic support was lifted yesterday. I'd still like to see a modified JobKeeper back. because that is the simplest way of getting people off the Centrelink queues. I was at the Fairfield Centrelink office yesterday. The queues have not reduced since the lockdown began because the situation is very complicated. And the frustration for construction workers, I understand, of course, we'll support and implement all the health orders, but you know, construction workers can't go to work in Fairfield. We probably have the healthiest construction workers in Australia being tested every 3 days. And it's pretty frustrating that they can't go to work when other people in supermarkets, etc., can. So there needs to be a lot more clarity. And as for the announcement of the military tonight, well, local members haven't been consulted or informed as to what role they'll be playing. And if the military is going to play a role, I would suggest that community leaders and MPs need to be brought on deck pretty quickly to explain what role the military will be playing, because Ron is right. I mean, there's a Pol Air helicopter over the top of my house 4 times a day. I understand what stress that provides, and military on the street, if not very sensitively and carefully handled, could add to that tension.
Let's go to Clover more, because I guess, Clover, it's your job to tell Ron that, as Chris Bowen indicated, because he's in one of those 8 lockdown local government areas, even though construction is returning, he can't go to work.
No, and it's, I think what he described is the very grim scene, and people are really anxious, and the $750 isn't going to do it. And really, you know, what we need is everyone to get vaccinated so that the lockdown can be lifted. And I mean, that's just the answer to all of this. And I think people feel really failed by government, by the federal government, for not getting that vaccine out to people and not communicating to them that it was absolutely essential that people get vaccinated. I mean, to think that, you know, the people who are now dying are unvaccinated, and to think 25% of people over 70 are not vaccinated just means there has been totally inadequate communication. And I think that this is what the people of Fairfield must be feeling. They're being told now to stay at home, and they have jobs that clearly aren't desk jobs, and they're totally angry and frustrated, and yet, you know, the vaccination message just simply hasn't got out there, and that's because the vaccination hasn't been here. You know, there's been a slight increase over the last week, but only 18% of people are vaccinated now, and we need to get to 80% before we can go back to normal. So what are we going to say to the person who called in? You're going to have an awful lot of long time to wait if we're going to have to get to 80%. So I think the situation is grim. There's no other way to describe it. And really, I hope the federal government, I hope the Prime Minister's listening, because he's really got to get his act together and get that vaccination to us. And the thing I'd ask him to do is get on the phone to President Biden. You know, we're the willing ally. We go to war when the US wants us to go to war. You know, we're you know, in what was just described in Fairfield as a type of war zone, and that's how many people feel. We need the vaccine.
Let me go to Senator Bragg, who's representing the government tonight, and there's a fair bit in that for you, Senator.
Well, I mean, Ron, I mean, the first duty of government is to look after its citizens, and when a government closes down a business, it needs to compensate that business. Now, if you're a sole trader, if you're a sparky or an electrician, or you're a builder, I mean, there are payments there. I accept that the $1,000 a week for a sole trader is only going to be a temporary stopgap. I mean, I think there is more that we will have to do once we get through this pandemic to help construction and to help traders get back on their feet. And look, it's all well and good for people who have desk jobs to say, look, they can work from home. It's easy to walk into your kitchen table and put your computer down, but I mean, many people like you, Ron, can't actually work from home. So I think we have a very heavy duty that we owe to you. But it is most important now, as Clover says, that we get on board with the vaccination. 200,000 in the last day, which is a record, including 80,000 in New South Wales. So whilst New South Wales is currently dealing with a very serious outbreak, on this track, we're going to be the first out and the first to freedom.
Deborah Cheetham?
Well, I agree with much that has been said, and I just want to say to Ron, we really feel your pain. We've been through that here in Melbourne. Lockdown is a necessary but a blunt tool, and it has a long tail. The industry I'm in, for instance, the arts industry, lockdown has a very long tail for us, and many of my colleagues were not eligible for payments during that very long period last year and in the ensuing lockdowns this year. It is the only way out is vaccination, and we need the federal government to step up and do the one job that has been given in this crisis, and that is to roll out the vaccination to Australian citizens.
Well, we've basically touched on almost everything we're probably going to get to this evening, and let's not throw it all on the floor at the beginning. I want to bring in Kushal Vyas from Wetherill Park in southwestern Sydney, who's, of course, in that area now that is hard locked down, and that's, I think, a pretty accurate term. Kushal, good to talk to you, and thanks for joining us this evening. What Ron describes, is that pretty much how you and those that you know feel in that part of Sydney?
Thanks, Virginia. And in all honesty, I mean, obviously, can't go there. One of the fortunate few that is able to work from home, and, you know, that itself is a privilege to the moment. I think it does summarise a lot of what's being felt. I think a bigger part of what's also been felt, that people inherently in places like southwestern Sydney and western Sydney more generally are not against the enforcement of health regulations and the enforcement of things that are for our own safety. But I think what's really frustrated a lot of our community is the fact that whilst it's enforced against what is a sense of a double standard in the way that those rules have been applied, in that a lot of the questions of a lot of people across our area is, where was this enforcement in places and more affluent places like Bondi, where break.
Yeah, we've got your line breaking up a lot there, Kushal. We might leave it there, Kushal, just because the line is breaking up so much. But we got the sense of that point there, which is a really crucial one. And it was an issue that was really grappled with in Victoria and Melbourne as well, about the unequal treatment of people in this pandemic when there's an outbreak. I will come to you about this, Mohammed. But Clover Moore, does that strike you as unfair? As we've heard mentioned already, the choppers in the air and the ADF on the ground as well caused great ructions in Melbourne. Your response?
It sounds like a war zone. I mean, it'd be terribly frightening for people. I mean, I think the other thing that should have happened that hasn't happened, it would seem, is that we have very effective promotion of vaccination, and we do it in multilingual. It's multilingual, and it's on the mainstream. It's also on social media, so that people understand how important it is that they get vaccinated. And you know, if there's an issue about people not understanding, well, we make sure that we're communicating with people. We are the most multicultural nation, and I just want to say that since I've been mayor, I've made 25,000 people Australian citizens, and
I think we're getting way away from the question here. The question was about it was about Clover Moore. It was about unequal treatment. That the cluster, the outbreak started in Bondi. There were never ADF boots on the ground in Bondi, but now we see them in southern and western Sydney, just as we saw with the Housing Commission towers here in Melbourne. We never saw them at Toorak. We saw them, of course, at the Housing Commission Tower. So how do you explain that different treatment?
I can't explain it. Government would have to explain it. But what I can say is, if they think people in southwestern Sydney don't know what they're meant to be doing, they should have effective multilingual campaigns. If they think people in southwestern Sydney are multicultural and don't understand English, look, I just want to say that I think I've only seen one ad from the federal government, and I've got to say it was a very boring one. But you know, if you want people to do something, you communicate with them.
OK, well, let's hear from Deborah Cheetham.
I think there are a set of assumptions here, and I just want to bring the point back to Australia has a long history with over-policing. I mean, there's nothing that you can tell me about that as an Aboriginal woman. Over-policing is what is exactly happening here. The point was made, and rightly so, that this outbreak actually began in the eastern suburbs. If you scrutinise any group of people for long enough, you'll find something that annoys you or some behaviour that's not exactly exemplary. These people are being targeted, and we're targeting this problem. We're talking about it as a problem that belongs to immigrants. I'm sorry, but everybody who arrived here after 1788 is an immigrant.
Is an immigrant, yes.
So
but we're multicultural, and we need to be able to. We need to understand.
Clover, let Deborah speak.
I think if we could get the message right in English first.
I agree. We get it right in English first.
There has been so much confusion from the federal coalition.
Let me go to Mohammed. Mohammed?
I have seen more police in my neighbourhood in the last couple of weeks than I have ever seen police in the rest of my life combined. And if there's anything that anybody knows about Western Sydney, is that it is the most culturally and linguistically diverse place in the country. And also that it has always been seen as the culturally and linguistically diverse and socioeconomically disadvantaged side of Sydney. Yeah. And so it's very, very difficult for me and other members of our community not to think that the agenda in over-policing our community is built on racist and classist motivations. And I'll quickly say this. Let me finish this, please. Yeah. Let me just finish this. I'll quickly say that we've seen time and time again that over-policing poor communities of colour is a recipe for disaster, and the way the government can solve this problem is by treating everybody fairly and equally.
Communicating with them.
Clover, I just wanted to pick up with Mohammed there. Do you believe, or do you know or understand whether communications with coloured communities there around in those local government areas, has it been adequate? Has it been in many different languages? Has there been enough outreach?
No. And
the question was
agree.
to Mohammed. Clover Moore. Mohammed?
I personally think it's the wrong question. It's not a question of whether the information has been communicated to us. We speak English. The actual problem is that no one is going to just come right out and admit there's a racist agenda. You know, the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister of Australia, John Howard, was saying the other day that he doesn't think there's an underlying race problem in Australia after the 2005 Cronulla riots, in which 5,000 white Australians were saying no lebs and physically assaulting anybody that was of Middle Eastern appearance. We have to start having honest conversations about the mistreatment of Indigenous people and people of colour if we want to have an honest conversation about how COVID is playing out in our society today.
Ben, very quickly, I just want to hear from Chris Bowen on this, because, again, this was another experience in Victoria where communities that weren't easily reached by language and also, of course, were the most exposed communities when it came to the kind of work that they did. As we've noted, they can't work from home. They are working in essential service industries. Has there been an adequate understanding of that in New South Wales, that as a particular problem within the pandemic, both protecting those people and also protecting everyone else?
Well, it's improved recently off a low base, Virginia. But firstly, can I just deal directly with the point that Krishal raised, because he's right. It was incredibly frustrating and has been incredibly frustrating to see those scenes in Bondi. I mean, I'm not trying to divide Sydney. On the contrary, I'm trying to unite Sydney to do the right thing. It's called the Bondi Cluster. We didn't start it in Fairfield, but to be out there on the weekend, as I was, and all the community leaders have been, explaining to people the need to follow the rules, and then to see effectively a mass gathering at Bondi with people maybe technically exercising alone but coming together to exercise in big numbers was just wrong. Should have been better enforcement of that. It sent a terrible message to the rest of Sydney that, as I said before, we've got police helicopters over our houses, a heavy police presence, that's fine, but it's got to be applied equally. The exercise rules at that point were the same in Bondi as they were in Fairfield, but they were very different scenes. You could find people in Fairfield complying with the rules, doing the right thing, following every request and direction. Terribly disheartening and frustrating to see those scenes. So I agree with Krishal. On the matter of communications, it has improved. I hear a lot of people say we need communications in language. That's 10% of it, Virginia. It's got to be not only in language. Yes, Mohammed's right, English is important, but language is also important. But it's got to be taking into account the different circumstances. So take, for example, some cultural groups and people of particular heritage in my community. It is not uncommon to find a street of 3 or 4 houses in a row owned by cousins and brothers. When you talk to them about stay in your family, you've got to communicate very, very carefully that actually you mean household, not family, because the rules have to be applied equally, but you have to really think through how you communicate it. It has improved recently, over the last days and weeks, but off a very low base.
And I just quickly want to hear from Senator Bragg on this, because I know that you hold a view that people were breaking the rules by going to each other's families and homes, but Chris Bowen has just put some context around that. Does that shift your view?
Look, and I agree with what Chris is saying there on that point. I mean, but what I would say is that this is a risk-based approach. Now, when there was an outbreak on the northern beaches in Sydney, there were barricades and there were police. There have been police at Bondi, and there are police at Fairfield, and this is a risk-based approach. Where there is transmission, there will be police. Now, I just say, in terms of the allegations of racism, I mean, the Premier of the state is a daughter of refugees who didn't speak English until she was 5, so I just don't think that's a fair cop at all.
Well, Virginia, just briefly...
racism predates Gladys Berejiklian's reign.
Hang on, just hearing from Deborah here, then we'll come to you, Chris. Deborah?
Sure.
I'm really so tired of having this conversation with members of mostly the coalition government. Racism is embedded in the very nature of Australia, and until we have those conversations that Mohammed was talking about before, we will never, ever be a fully mature emotionally mature nation. And yes, Gladys is the daughter of migrants. Fair enough, but it predates Gladys and it's embedded very deeply, and it will take great courage to shake the racism that fuels almost every conversation that I have.
Let's get our next question, and it comes from Jasmine Riley.
We have seen the COVID-19 pandemic interrupt lives and livelihoods across Australia. However, its impact and people's ability to comply with lockdowns and restrictions has been notably different for those in precarious and insecure work. I acknowledge the disaster relief payments, but given the previous success of JobKeeper, why is the government reluctant to provide a similar wage subsidy?
Let's go straight to you, Senator Bragg, about that one.
Well, I mean, it's a very significant package for business. I mean, if you're running a small business with a turnover of $5 million, you will get a subsidy of $1.2 million annualised. Sole traders get $1,000 a week, and individual workers get a $750 disaster payment. So that is a stopgap payment, right? But I think, look, there is more that we need to do for sectors that have been flattened by government regulations. We can build on our record on arts. We've already spent $400 million there. There's more we need to do in hospitality and tourism. And I think we should look at things like opening up super for another early release to complement the Commonwealth payments.
We'll get to super in a moment, but do you believe this figure is high enough, the amount that's been promised, the new lift? Because I know before it came out, you were saying that you did want to see it higher, Senator. So is it high enough?
Well, the $750 is 2/3 of the median wage, so it's not a replacement for a full wage for everyone, but it is a stopgap. I think there is more we will need to do, yes, but it needs to be a sector-by-sector approach. I mean, not everyone has lost their jobs, but many people will lose income and work, and so I think we need to address these issues as they emerge.
Why not JobKeeper? Why not bring that back?
Well, I think in some senses this is better. I mean, some small businesses will actually get more money from this scheme than they will have received from JobKeeper.
Chris Bowen?
Yeah, thanks, Virginia. Well, and thank you for the question, Jasmine. You've raised an important point. You've raised an important point about the current situation with JobKeeper, and you're right, a JobKeeper or something very close to it. Change the name if you want to, improve it if you want, that's fine, but bring back JobKeeper or something very close to it, because it is simple, easy to understand, and it worked. And it had strong support across the community and the Parliament. Just bring it back. But also, I just want to say to Jasmine, thank you for raising it, because it's actually about more than this pandemic. We have a pandemic of insecurity across the workforce and across our economy and our society. We've got casualisation rates through the roof. We've got people who are working 2 or 3 jobs, and I don't want to see an underclass in Australia develop of casual workers, of people whose health and safety is endangered every time they get on a motorbike to deliver meals to the rest of us. That's not the sort of country we are.
Okay.
That's why Labor has prioritised improved workplace laws for casual workers and has put this on the agenda, because casual work is on the up, and it's got huge implications for our economy and our society and the individuals. Health implications. People who work in a heavily casualised industry have worse physical and mental health. All right, the evidence is very clear.
Let me go to Clover Moore on this.
Government and the society.
I want to go to Clover Moore on this. You're seeing it play out in your city. What do you think?
Yes, well, business told me business had told me very strongly that they came through last year's pandemic because of JobKeeper. And, you know, I've been calling for JobKeeper to be reinstated, as have others. And the packages that were brought down by the federal and state governments on the 13th of July were good, but didn't go far enough. And it wasn't JobKeeper. The package, the additional payments that were announced yesterday have brought the amount up to JobKeeper. But I just wonder why the government didn't just reintroduce JobKeeper, because we knew it had worked. Business had acclaimed it as helping them get through. And if there were issues around some corporations being greedy and exploiting it, they could have taken action about that. But because, people have waited 4 or 5 weeks to get this announcement, and so there's been that uncertainty, and this is all terribly stressful. and it's terribly stressful for people who aren't working and whose businesses are affected. And we just know that those 2 payments last year really worked, and I think it would have been helpful to reintroduce them. But I think the payments now have brought it up to that standard, and that's good.
Do you think it came in too late, Senator Bragg?
It's faster. I mean, you get these payments faster. You can get these payments.
No, but did the change in the announcement and the lift of it, did it come in too late?
Came in yesterday.
Because I think the packages have evolved as the situation has evolved. I mean, yesterday the Sydney lockdown was extended by 1 month, and so this new package rolled off the conveyor belt. So I think it's been pretty responsive.
It's been responsive.
Well,
it's been responsive.
Well, that was Sydney's lockdown, but we've had 2 this year in Melbourne, post-JobKeeper. So in time for Sydney, and I applaud that it needs to happen. But what about Melbourne?
It's lower in Melbourne and higher for New South Wales. Senator Bragg, is that a mistake?
We spent billions and billions more in Melbourne last year on JobKeeper because of the extended lockdown there. So. You know, Melbourne's had a pretty good go, I'd say. And let's just be...
I wouldn't call it a good go if you'd stayed through these 5 months and you don't know. I'm sorry to Senator Bragg. You do not know what is ahead for Sydney. It could it could outstretch everything that you spent in Melbourne by billions of dollars.
Well,
let's not compare oranges and apples here.
Well, if I can just say something. So, I mean, New South Wales has carried Australia during this pandemic. I mean, people want to come home, they want to get back from overseas. We've quarantined these people through New South Wales. New South Wales is now dealing with an outbreak and the Commonwealth is coming to the table. I think that's entirely appropriate.
Isn't the country dealing with this problem, though, because New South Wales is too slow to respond to this outbreak?
No, because New South Wales...
Isn't that something that's been conceded even by the government, that you need to crack down hard and fast on these lockdowns?
Well, I think the lockdowns have evolved as the situation has evolved, but the fact is that New South Wales has done more than its fair share. I mean, we're still doing hotel quarantine. So therefore it deserves more money than Victoria? We're still doing hotel quarantine now. I mean, Australians actually want to come home to Australia, and we're still doing quarantine, which Victoria didn't do when they had their shutdown last year.
There's an open question here about what the federal government's doing about getting those Australians home who want to come home, but putting that to one side, are you saying the equivalence you seem to be making here is that New South Wales deserves more money and Victoria's got enough because New South Wales is doing the heavy lifting? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying that any jurisdiction deserves any more, but you know, people always want to bash up on New South Wales, but we have absolutely carried more than our fair share during this pandemic. There's an outbreak now in Sydney. It needs to be managed. The Commonwealth's come to the table, and that's a good thing.
All right, let's go to our next question. It's a video question. It comes from Daniel HOWARTH.
Good evening, panel. Earlier this week, Senator Bragg floated the idea of a second early release of super to help those struggling with the COVID-19 pandemic. The last time this happened, there was an uptick in spending on non-essential items like gambling and alcohol. Knowing that this has a major effect on the long-term wealth of those who take the money out, is this the best option we have for dealing with the pandemic?
On that point, Senator, I will come to you first of all. Nearly half of those who got access to their super last time around, they saw no drop in their income during COVID, but they took it out anyway. And as Daniel's just said, nearly 2/3 spent it on alcohol, gambling and clothes. So you want us to have another dip?
Well, Virginia, we have a $3 trillion superannuation system where you see $30 billion in fees go out every single year. Now, as we face this economic shock, I think it's only appropriate that the super funds should be able to help Australians if they want to do things like pay down mortgages. Now, last year when we had early release, 60% of the money taken out was used to pay down debts like mortgages. So
would you put some restrictions around it? Would you put restrictions around it, given that we saw how much of that was spent on stuff that was not necessary in a pandemic? Would you put restrictions around it?
Look, I'd be very happy to do that. But the point is that it's the people's money, right? So if people want to pay down their mortgage, they should be able to do that. It's an economic shock. It's their money.
I know Chris Bowen's champing at the bit to speak to this.
I'm sure.
Mohammed, is there anything you want to add in here?
Just about the last two questions together. Look, Australia is an incredibly fortunate country. It can afford to look after all its citizens properly, and so that's what we should do.
Yeah.
Chris Bowen?
Yeah.
I agree.
It's a terrible idea from Andrew. It is frankly offensive. I think it's morally bankrupt. the Liberals, and Andrew in particular, seem to have one solution when anybody's doing it tough: make them mortgage their future. I think it was outrageous that Andrew actually took ads out during the last lockdown and encouraged people to access their super. You've got 500,000 people who've got their super down to zero as a result of the last change. If you're doing it tough now, you should not have to raid your retirement income to get food on the table now. That is morally offensive. The only worst idea I've heard is the Liberal government policy from a few months ago to encourage victims of domestic violence to raid their own super, which they were forced to back down. This is utterly outrageous. Superannuation is for a dignified retirement for all Australians of all incomes, workers included, and to force people or encourage people to live now to raid their super is morally reprehensible, and it is absolutely outrageous that Andrew was encouraging people to do it.
All right, I'm going to come back to the Senator for a right of reply, but Deborah, Cheetham, I did want to ask you, what does the average super fund of an arts industry worker look like?
Very slight, I would say. And I would also make the point that I am the first generation of Aboriginal citizens of this country who will live to claim their super, or at least I hope, if I survive Q&A this evening, that I will live to be able to...
You're doing all right so far.
That I'll live long enough to be able to claim super. So not everybody has enjoyed superannuation in this country. And for First Nations people, this is something new. This is something to look forward to. And I think, in a way, also I'd say this dipping into super now, I think that disadvantages young people in yet another way.
Andrew Bragg, it seems friendless here on the panel tonight.
I'm not surprised.
Do you want to have another go at defending it? Well, I mean, you'll have to make the case that it's really necessary. The government, as you noted, is pumping a lot of money into supporting people, and that's been justly celebrated, and that's a good thing that the government is doing that. But going one more to the superannuation after what history has already taught us about it?
Well, because superannuation is the people's money. It doesn't belong to the super fund managers or to the unions or the banks.
It's the people's money for the future, not for right now.
But it's their money, and if they want to pay down their mortgage, because
so it's not superannuation then. It's not super. It's something else. It's just a slush fund of money that you have there.
Well, as you know, Virginia, I mean, fewer and fewer Australians will be able to afford a house, and one of the things that can be done with super is for people to pay down their mortgage. So that's what happened last year when we had early release. So I just think if people want to do that, why would we deny them that opportunity? I mean,
so rather than dealing with housing affordability, you actually get rid of your money for retirement.
Well,
you can't have both.
It's their money. It's their money. I mean, this paternalism, I think, is very dangerous.
I know Clover Moore wants to say something here.
Oh, well, I agree with what Chris Bowen said, and also I think governments should have policies about affordable housing.
Okay. Well, I think we have a discussion about that coming up as well a little later as well. But we'll go to our next video question, and it comes from Sarah McDonald.
Hi, my name's Sarah, and I am from Blacktown in Western Sydney, which has been seriously affected by recent COVID restrictions. I have noticed that there is a lot of pressure on government to compensate those who have lost their income due to the COVID crisis. But what can be said of super-rich individuals and corporations? Surely, if you have enough money to orbit space, you can also share some of the responsibility of COVID amongst the sick and poor. Why is it that more is not asked of the top 1% in addition to our government when dealing with this pandemic?
It's a very interesting question there from Sarah. I'll go to you, Mohammed. Who are the top space orbiters here in Australia who should be asked to give some money back?
Look, with all due respect, I feel like we've been asked the same question 6 or 7 times. We understand there's a very serious problem. It's an economic problem. People are struggling. People are suffering, and people are doing it incredibly tough. And we are on the panel today trying to hold the government accountable and trying to do more and asking that more is taken to support people from socioeconomically less advantaged backgrounds. So I don't really know what else to say except what's already been said.
But the question specifically goes to the different experience of life and the inequality in our country, Mohammed. I'm sure you do have something to say on this, given that there are incredibly wealthy people who have been banking their salary during the pandemic and others who haven't. Is there a moral responsibility on them to put their hand in their pocket?
Yes, I mean, if you really want me to tell you what I genuinely think on this matter, I don't think rich people should exist. I think we need to have a more equal society.
All right, well, we're nailing our colours to the mast here. That's fair enough. You're entitled to have those colours. And I'll come to the Senator, of course, but Chris Bowen?
Well, thanks for the question, Sarah. And, yeah, I've seen that amount of money spent on putting people in space too, and I've shared your concerns that maybe that money could have been better spent on problems here on our planet. But, you know, that's happening in America, to be fair, so that's not really something we can deal with. But, I mean, I think we've seen this too in recent times with JobKeeper. As you know, I mean, I've made very clear I think JobKeeper should come back, but it could also come back in a modified form so that those who've done very well out of it, who are doing quite well themselves, don't get it, or many people have voluntarily given it back, and I think more could have. So I think that is pretty in keeping with Sarah's point. Well, let me
pick up that point and come to you, Senator Bragg, because your government did actually give a whole lot of money, I guess, to the 1% that Sarah's referring to there. In the 3 months of JobKeeper, in the first 3 months, $12.5 billion went to entities that didn't meet the shortfalls that they predicted that they would meet, and $4.6 billion went to firms with rising earnings, and that's money that's just gone. So our money, taxpayers' money, went to the 1%, no hope of getting it back, no legislated change to get it back. Is that why JobKeeper hasn't come back?
Well, I mean, I think that there were some instances which were regrettable. I think there's no doubt about that. But overall, I mean, the program was...
$12.5 billion worth of regrettable.
Well, I think the whole program was very successful. I mean, it's more than a $100 billion program, a very, very big program for the Commonwealth. And it kept Australia together during the deepest parts of the pandemic, as you know. And I think overall people would say it was successful because it also kept a lot of money slushing around the economy. So the thing is, we have spent a lot of taxpayer funds to ensure that business could get to the other side, as we say. So I think there is an obligation on business to ensure that they're investing, especially in the sectors that have been affected. I mean, I think more taxpayer funds needs to be found for sectors like hospitality, tourism and the arts. But also, I think we can expect more pressure to be put onto big business to also co-invest with us.
Is there pressure that the government could put on them? The Federal Treasurer has said there's no mechanism in the legislation so far that you introduced to get that money back. So why not fix that? Why not make that change and try and get that money back that clearly was not needed by those companies that actually ended up just banking the profit?
Well, I think there's a conversation to be had about trying to get some of that money reinvested in the economy, especially in some of those heavily affected industries that we've heard from tonight.
All right, Clover, would you like to say anything there?
Well, I would. I'd just like to say that we're looking to the future. I think both the Coalition and the Labor Party should not be considering tax cuts for the rich, and I think they should both be developing policies to help people whose livelihoods that have been so badly affected by the pandemic. We're going to have a tremendous hit on our economy as a result of the pandemic, and I think both those major parties should be looking at ways to look after people rather than giving tax cuts to the rich, or considering and consider policies like removing negative gearing. You know, the sorts of things that were talked about at the last election. They're the sorts of policies that governments need to adopt now, because we're going into a really tough period post-pandemic, because people are suffering as a result of the pandemic. They will suffer into the future. Livelihoods have been lost and people need to be looked after. And I think the parties should be reviewing their policies in the light of the pandemic.
Let's go to
they shouldn't be favouring the rich and the top 1%.
Absolutely. Well, let's go to our next question. It comes from Kate Adams.
Thanks, Virginia. Hi, everyone. I'm an artist manager from here in Melbourne, Naarm. Over the last year and a half, it's been really difficult for our whole music community. Nearly everybody I know, including myself, have had shows cancelled or rescheduled. From both a financial and mental health perspective, it's been really devastating. The most recent lockdowns in Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia have seen thousands of live music events cancelled again. Much like the Olympics, music and live events lift our spirits. But we are staring down the barrel of another summer without live music and events. The only way forward for many of us to survive is a government-backed insurance scheme. Does the panel think we might see some cooperation around this from the Federation to get us back to live shows?
I think we'll go straight to Chris Bowen on that.
Well, thank you, Kate, for the question, and you have our support as well for the trouble you're going through. And I think I will get to your question, but I also think this is probably a prime example of announcement over delivery. You saw the big spin announcement from Scott Morrison with Guy Sebastian about backing the arts, and then you've seen Guy Sebastian come out and say effectively, my words, not his, but he was used in that announcement, and the delivery has not matched what he was led to believe would be announced on that day. On the idea of an insurance policy, I mean, I'm sure our relevant spokesperson, Tony Burke, would be happy to sit down with you and talk through how that might work and how that might help going forward, because we are going to be, regrettably, in this environment for some time, and you're 100% right. A nation gets a lot of succour from its arts and its culture. It's an injection for the soul, and we need it desperately. Regardless of what sort of art you prefer and our personal choices, we desperately need our art sector back to tell Australian stories, more than ever before, to tell Australian stories. And it's just terrible that we haven't been able to hear the stories being told by you and your colleagues and Deborah's colleagues, and anything sensible to help us get there, I think, would find a very welcoming ear from the opposition. And if the government did do something sensible, we would give it strong bipartisan backing.
I'll come to our other representatives here in a moment, but the artists in the room I really want to hear from in particular. And Mohammed, I'll come to you too. Deborah Cheetham, I'll start with you.
As I mentioned earlier, the lockdown measures have a very long tail in the arts sector, and confidence is gone. We can't plan into the future. I mean, in the last 12 months, my own company, all of our programming cancelled. Programs that were, and performances that were cancelled last year, postponed until this year, cancelled in this last series of lockdowns. And we have no roadmap out of that. We need a national framework that allows the arts industries to, well, to be afforded the same kind of opportunity that we see in sporting codes, where we are firstly innocent until proven guilty. It's the opposite at the moment.
What do you mean?
Well, look at some of our venues here in Melbourne. Hamer Hall, 0 infections. The MRC, 0 infections. The Palais Theatre, 0 infections. And yet we're closed down. Our capacity, even after opening, after this last lockdown, is limited to 100. It's unviable for the arts organisations. There isn't an arts organisation in this country that has gone unscathed by the lockdown measures. So we need a way forward. We need to, you know...
Is it an insurance scheme? Is that the... Is that what we're talking about?
We certainly need that. That needs to underpin everything.
Well, let me come to the others. Mohammed, what do you think? You've got quite an interesting take on this, actually, which is that the individual response at this time is a really important one too, just what you can achieve where you are.
Yes, I'll answer that from the point of view of the literary community.
Yeah.
You know, I could come out here and sulk about how hard it's been for the last 18 months for writers and for the, writing industry. But I would rather use the platform to talk about what we can do to support the arts and specifically the writing community. Right now, people are in lockdown. They have more time than ever to do some reading. And when I say reading, I obviously don't mean being on Facebook all day, sharing memes about conspiracy theories that COVID is a hoax.
Let's not even repeat it here.
Yeah. What I'm talking about is engaging in the incredible literature that's been developed this year, fiction and non-fiction. We've had a very hard period of trying to have serious conversations about deaths in custody, the rise of Islamophobia, anti-Asian violence in the context of COVID. And so this is an opportunity to engage in some of the literature that's been produced this year on these subjects and preparing ourselves and our children for the world that we're going to have after the pandemic.
In fact, some of the writing that you've been doing focuses on that and on the connection and the crossovers between religions and between communities.
I think you're referring to my new book, The Other Half of You, specifically in relation to that question. I have written an interfaith and intercultural love story, a letter to my son. And, the last couple of years have been incredibly difficult. An Australian-born white supremacist entered into a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand, 2 mosques, in fact, and slaughtered 51 Muslims peacefully conducting their Friday prayers. The deaths in custody, hundreds of deaths of Indigenous deaths in custody since 1993, the rise of anti-Asian violence. And I wanted to tell a story that brings us together, that unifies us, and that starts reminding us that there is hope and that love can triumph in such difficult times.
Let me take Senator Bragg, though, back to the original question about an insurance scheme. Are you attracted by that idea? Do you think that's viable or something that might be useful?
Well, I mean, I'd just say in terms of the other statements that have been made, I mean, the $400 million which has been outlined to support the arts. I mean, the money is going out the door. I mean, I rang 12 or 15 people this week to tell them about the grants that they're going to receive. They'll be on the website tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So the money is going out the door. And in terms of the insurance scheme, I'm very happy to have a look at it.
So you like the idea? You think it would work?
Well, I don't know anything about it.
Well, has the government considered an insurance? It's been spoken about for months now. Have you considered an insurance scheme?
I'm just not across the detail, but I'm very happy to have a look at it.
Clover, I know you want to speak, but everyone looks to the federal government for an insurance scheme. There's nothing stopping a state government from putting one in place. Do you know if the Berejiklian government is considering that?
No, but I know that there are calls for an events insurance scheme, and we know that the amount of planning that goes into putting on a performance, an event, can be 9 to 12 months, and to then just have the performance stopped just as it's about to start has been absolutely devastating in Sydney, as it has been in Melbourne, and there have been, you know, very serious calls for government to underwrite an events insurance scheme, and it's really, really important it's on the agenda, whether it's the federal or the state government. I think it's more a federal matter. It should be a national matter. But as Deborah has said, the creative industries, arts have just taken such a huge hit with the pandemic. Everything stopped, and it does have a very long tail, and it's going to take a very long time to get everything up and running again. And people need to know that there is an insurance scheme there to support them.
You wanted to jump in there, I think, again, Deborah.
Oh, I just wanted to say that I agree with Clover. I feel it does need to be a national approach. We have a touring economy in the arts industry. We need to have a coordinated approach. If it's state by state and there are different rules everywhere, it simply won't work.
No more state by state. That'd be a change of things, wouldn't it,
Well,
Deborah?
we're a continent.
Apparently we are. Our next question is a video one, and it comes from Stephen G.
I think two issues that the Labor opposition must have policies on, because they're a national issue, is one, giving wealthy retirees tax refunds when they haven't paid any tax, and two, negative gearing as a tax system that encourages people who've already got a property to own multiple properties. If Labor doesn't want to address these issues and wants to just be Liberal light, then I'm afraid they're going to lose again. And if they lose again, I think they should get out of the game and let someone else have a go.
It's a question directly there for you, Chris Bowen.
5 minutes left.
I guess Stephen's really saying...
Happy birthday, Chris.
Stephen's really saying, what's the point of Labor?
Well, I'm happy to talk about what Labor believes in.
No. You can answer the question directly, which goes to the key changes you've just made, which have been bedrock policies and points of difference from the coalition, and now you're saying, no, you're the same. So why?
No, we're not saying... No, well, I don't accept that premise, Virginia, but I'm more than happy to deal with Stephen's issue, but he did say, what does Labor believe in? But in terms of the issues Stephen raised, look, we went to the last two elections in relation to negative gearing and the last election in relation to franking credits with policies. We also have to accept that we came second in those elections, and election defeats have consequences. It means you have to rethink your approach. It doesn't mean, for example, you walk away from caring about housing affordability. That means you think about the best way of achieving the same objective. So,
I'm sorry to jump in there, Chris, but I've got to pick you up on that. I mean, it was so interesting to hear from people like Natural Shelter saying that you've now joined, they said, their list of enemies. And they, of course, are a peak organisation looking after housing affordability following that policy change. So you've now made enemies with the housing affordability organisation that you would hope to be standing shoulder to shoulder with during an election. So when it comes to housing affordability, you've just blotted your copybook, according to...
Well, I know Shelter well, and I've worked with them closely in previous portfolios.
Not in the future, it would seem.
Well, the point I was making, Virginia, if I could just make the point, is that we do have a range of housing policies and we have more to come. We actually think the federal government has a role to play in housing affordability. We have a housing minister in the Cabinet, in Jason Clare. He's already put out the Housing Future Fund, $10 billion investment in better housing, and there's more to do. I completely agree with that. Housing affordability is a crisis. It does need to be dealt with, and the federal government needs to care about it. The difference is that a federal Labor government would care about it. Maybe the policies we choose to pursue aren't to everybody's liking, like Stephen's, but we would be caring about housing affordability. You've got a federal government currently in office who just puts it all on state and local government. I don't think that is a sustainable way forward. I
know Senator Bragg is dying to jump in here, and you're going to get your shot, let me tell you. But the paper, the local paper, the Melbourne paper today, The Age, was full of letters who were Labor members, fully paid up members of Labor, saying they're going to have to reconsider their membership because their key principles that you're now abandoning in order to try and win election, I guess, at any ideological cost. Is that something you're really comfortable with?
Well, again, I don't accept the premise that you just put, Virginia, and you can only really...
I'm simply quoting what they say in their letters, which is, you guys having made this change, I am now reconsidering my membership of Labor. Anyone can pick up The Age today and see that letter there.
Yep, and if you could just let me make my point in response to that. You can only really assess the comparative policies of both sides at an election. We've announced some, and we have many more to announce. And there are and will be many more real points of difference between the government and the alternative government. We will be providing an alternative, not an echo. In my own portfolio area, we believe the world's climate emergency is Australia's jobs opportunity. We believe in an ambitious climate policy. The team that Andrew's on is full of climate change deniers who'd veto any real action on climate change. There are a range of issues that will be real points of difference between the government and the alternative government at the next election, and the Labor Party will go with a more focused, more prioritised, but equally ambitious agenda for the nation at the next election.
Senator Bragg, that's how you win elections these days in Australia, isn't it? No daylight between the main parties.
Well, you've got to say it was a great Dorothy Dixer, though. Thanks, Stephen. But look, I mean, Chris was the architect of those two tax policies. They were bad policies, and Labor has dispatched them. I mean, people took Chris's advice and didn't vote for Labor last time, but that is now all in the past. So the question for Labor is really, what is its agenda for growth? Because as far as I can see, they haven't got any policies for growth. I mean, we've got the patent box policy, investment allowances and the like, and Labor doesn't seem to like those ideas. So I'm quite optimistic that with those tax changes out of the way, that Labor might actually put some positive growth, accretive policies on the table.
Clover wants to jump in, but I'm first going to go to Mohammed and ask him whether you've got any advice for the Labor Party on policies that they might espouse that might pull back people like Stephen G.
I live in a suburb where a lot of young people will never be able to own a home and probably won't be able to pay off their HECS debts. So these conversations really bore me.
I had a feeling you might come up with something like that. But you need a major party that's going to stand up for those people you're speaking about then, Mohammed. You need them to come up with some sort of policy that speaks to you and those young people. I guess you're saying that neither of them do.
I haven't felt represented by any of the politicians today. I only feel represented by my black sister who's on the panel today.
OK. What did you want to say, Clover Moore?
I wanted to say they were good policies. They just weren't told very well. I think if we'd had perhaps a Bob Hawke out there, people might have voted for them. I just think they failed to communicate well what those policies were about. They were about Australia's future. And I think people feel very disillusioned about what seems to be an abandonment of Australia's future. And as I said before, coming out of the pandemic, both sides should have very compassionate policies about the future for the Australian people, because people are going to be doing it really hard after this period of the pandemic.
So good policies but a bad spruiker, you think? Do they have a better spruiker now?
Well, I won't comment on that. I'm just saying they were good policies.
Why ever not?
Well, I just think, as I said, that both sides should come up with policies for people coming out of a pandemic. And I think those policies would have been really fantastic for people coming out of a pandemic.
Deborah Cheetham, I'm tempted to quote Hamilton here. Many of us have seen it. If you stand for nothing, what'll you fall for?
Yeah, exactly that. Well, a couple of things. First of all, let's not forget Clive Palmer running interference. Was it all about franking credits and negative gearing? I don't know. Those big yellow banners still haunt me, and the interference that he ran. But I just want to say to both the major parties There are tonight 1 million, more than 1 million Australian children living in poverty. Where's the policy for them? I know that's not the conversation tonight, but I want to put that there. And Chris Bowen, if you are returned to power at the next election, I want to see the arts reinstated as its own department, not some office or closet in infrastructure, roads and management and goodness knows what else. The arts need to be restated. Make that promise tonight and I will consider voting for you.
Can you make that promise tonight, Chris Bowen?
Well, I can certainly give a commitment that Tony Burke, as a very senior Cabinet Minister, will be the Minister for the Arts, and he'll be a strong voice for the arts at the Cabinet table, and it will be the centre not only of the bureaucracy, but at the Cabinet, which is the most important thing. So I'm more than happy to set up a conversation between Deborah and Tony, but the important thing is we'll have a very senior Cabinet Minister for the arts who believes it, breathes it, and delivers on the commitments.
It's critical.
Let's go to our final question for the evening, and it's a video, and it's from RASHIMI GUPTA.
Hi panel, my question to you tonight is this. Has Australia lost the essence of what this country is about as outbreaks unravel throughout the country? I refer to the total different approaches of each Premier while dealing with this outbreak. What is the point of a national cabinet if there isn't any unity or consistency in how lockdowns and restrictions should be put in place? How can the health advice be so different in each state while dealing with the same disease? What can be done to have more of a unilateral approach? At the moment, I feel like I live in a completely different country here in Perth to the one where my sister is living in Sydney. Thank you.
RASHIMI, thank you for that question. I'm going to start with you, Mohammed, because I think you've really compellingly painted a picture this evening of your life, your community's life and how it feels for you. Does any of that in the experience and the question that RASHIMI asks, does it get you to a sense of being part of an Australia at this time?
There are very special spiritual moments that actually happen in Australia. We come together to fight for the right for every single person to be free to marry whoever they love. I remember after the Christchurch massacre, our non-Muslim brothers and sisters were willing to stand outside the mosque and guard it so that we could go inside and pray peacefully. These moments represent the best aspects of Australia, and they represent the fact that we are strongest when we stand together, when we stand in solidarity. And that's what we need to do. That's the only way we're going to pull through this crisis, if we actually come together and unite as a nation.
Clover Moore?
I agree with that. I think the people want to be together. I think the people want a common view. I think people want good, strong leadership and want governments to work together. I think they feel that very strongly, and they're proud to be Australian. And I think they feel that our leaders sometimes let them down.
Chris Bowen?
Well, there's two ways of answering RASHIMI's question. There's dealing with the technicalities of the National Cabinet, which I've always thought was more a headline than a reality. And I've always thought state premiers were going to do their best in the circumstances. But I think the better way of answering it is to say, in terms of what our country believes in, actually it's shone through the community. You know, when I put a Facebook post up in my community and somebody puts a comment saying, I don't have any food for the weekend, before I even get to that comment, there's members of my community commenting saying, send me a direct message, tell me what you need, and I'll be dropping food around to your front veranda. This is happening on a daily basis in affected areas right across the country. That's Australia. That's the Australia I love. It's the Australia we can all be proud of. And I think in many ways this has brought out, while it's brought out some tough things in our community, it's also brought out the best in our country.
Senator Bragg.
I mean, the country has performed extremely well during this pandemic. And I know people are sick of hearing this, but I mean, the fact is you've had a low death rate, a low infection rate compared to other countries that we compare ourselves to. And I think a lot of that is down to the National Cabinet structure, which has been a pretty good innovation. I know people are frustrated in not being able to see family across borders. It's very emotional for people not being able to reunite and be together for special occasions, and it's wreaked havoc on business. And we do need to fix that, and quickly. And my hope is that once everyone has had their opportunities to have 2 jabs, that we can open the place up. I mean, we can't be a hermit kingdom. We need to open up.
And Deborah Cheetham, have we lost the essence of Australia?
I'll tell you when we find it. But I think what we do long for, is a country that's capable of critical thought, a country that is emotionally mature and is led by by leaders who are empathetic to the plight of the people who are suffering the most in our country. A First Nations philosophy is this, simply put, that there is enough for everyone and that everyone should have enough.
And that's where we'll leave our panel and our discussion for this evening. Would you please thank our terrific panel, Deborah Cheetham, Andrew Bragg, Clover Moore, Chris Bowen and Michael Mohammed Ahmad.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Well done. And thank you for all of your really terrific questions as well. Now, as you're very aware, Hamish MacDonald has left Q&A and we wish him really well for the rest of his journalistic journey. And for the rest of the year, Q&A will be me, Stan Grant and David Spears joining you each week in whatever city that we're allowed to operate in, and that'll be a moving feast, I tell you. So next week, Stan Grant joins you from Sydney to look at how the rest of the world is getting on with life with COVID in the community and the level of risk that we are willing to accept here. And you can join me tomorrow morning on ABC Radio Melbourne. So stay safe, good night, go well.